The helicopter spun through the blizzard metal, shrieking against wind that wanted to tear it apart. Flames crawled along the fuselage orange against white heat, meeting cold in the kind of violence that meant someone was about to die. Through the shattered cockpit window, Marcus Reed could see her, the woman strapped in the co-pilot seat, blood streaming down her temple, eyes wide with the recognition that survival wasn't guaranteed. Elena Sterling's voice cut through the roar of wind and fire, desperate and commanding in equal measure. The pilot was already gone, neck twisted at an angle that meant death had been instant. The fuel tank was compromised, leaking vapor that would ignite any second. Every instinct Marcus had developed over 20 years of flying helicopters into situations where people died, screaming told him to run, to save himself, to honor the training that said you don't risk your life for corpses. But Elena Sterling wasn't a corpse yet. And Marines didn't leave people behind, even when behind meant burning metal and mathematics that didn't favor survival. Marcus tore the door open, smoke choking his lungs, heat searing exposed skin. Elena stared at him through the haze, seeing the radar technician who worked night shifts at the control tower, not understanding why he was here, how he'd found her, what made him willing to die for a stranger. Marcus didn't explain. He unclipped her harness, pulled her from the seat, wrapped his body around hers as the fuel tank ignited behind them. The explosion threw them into snowdrift, heat and light, consuming everything, the world reducing to white, and fire and the weight of a woman in his arms who was breathing, still breathing, alive, because he'd refused to let mathematics dictate morality. Then silence, absolute and complete, snow falling on burning wreckage, Elena unconscious against his chest. And Marcus Reed, 45 years old, radar technician, former Marine pilot, who'd sworn never to touch another helicopter, kneeling in Montana snow, wondering what the hell he'd just done. 18 hours earlier, the alarm clock screamed at 4:30, same as always, the sound cutting through dreams that were half memory, half nightmare. Marcus's hand found the button without conscious thought. 3 years of identical mornings carving neural pathways deeper than sleep. His apartment was small enough that he could hear Emma breathing from his mattress on the floor. No bed frame, because bed frames cost money, and money meant medication, meant the nebulizer sitting beside her bed like a guardian angel made of plastic, and necessity meant the EpiPen that cost $200 to replace and lived in constant fear of expiration dates. Marcus listened to his daughter's breathing with the attention other fathers gave stock markets or sports scores. The slight wheeze was there, always there, the baseline soundtrack of severe asthma that had defined Emma's 7 years on Earth. But it was steady, controlled, not the desperate gasping that meant crisis in emergency rooms and the kind of medical bills that crushed families who worked honest jobs for honest wages. He stood knees protesting. 45 felt older when you'd spent 2 decades flying rescue missions through conditions that killed pilots with worse judgment or better luck. The scars on his back agreed with his knees, the shrapnel wounds from Hellman, the burns from a helicopter that had gone down hard in circumstances that remained classified even in his nightmares. Coffee percolated while Marcus counted bills on the kitchen counter. $53 between paychecks. Emma's medication refill was due Friday. $400. The mathematics were simple and impossible. He'd already sold everything from his service years that held resale value, the watch his commanding officer had given him, the flight helmet that had saved his life in 3 separate crashes, the medals that meant something to everyone except landlords and pharmacies. Rebecca's photograph, watched from the mantel, frozen in a moment of joy that felt like accusation now. 3 years dead from cancer that had eaten her from inside, while Marcus watched helplessly, learning that combat trained you for many things, but not for watching your wife dissolve into pain and morphine, and final words about protecting Emma, about not letting their daughter grow up thinking the world was nothing but loss. Marcus raised his coffee mug toward the photograph, the gesture that had replaced prayer in his personal theology. Emma's door opened before he finished the sentence. She emerged holding her stuffed rabbit, Captain Hoppy, named by a 3-year-old's logic, and defended with 7-year-old fierceness. Her blonde hair tangled from sleep eyes, the exact blue that Rebecca's had been, that shade that made Marcus's chest tight every time he looked at his daughter and saw his dead wife staring back. Emma's voice carried the rasp that came from lungs that fought for every breath, the permanent hoarseness that doctors said might improve with age or might not, depending on variables nobody could predict. Marcus knelt, bringing himself to eye level, the position he'd learned in parenting books, that said you should meet children where they were instead of forcing them to crane upward. Emma smiled, the expression transforming her face from sick child to simply child, the distinction Marcus fought to maintain. She reached for her inhaler on the coffee table, took 2 measured puffs without prompting, held her breath for the count of 5 before exhaling. The routine was automatic, drilled through 3 years of practice until it became reflex. Her breathing eased. She climbed into his lap, Captain Hoppy tucked under one arm, her small body fitting against his chest in the way that made every sacrifice feel justified. The question came every few weeks, cycling through Emma's consciousness like a song she couldn't forget. Marcus chose his words with the care he'd once used for radio calls in hostile territory. Emma absorbed this with the gravity she brought to every answer. Marcus gave the seriousness of a child who'd learned too young that adults sometimes lied to make things easier, but her father never did. Marcus lifted her despite the protest from his back and knees, carried her to the bathroom where morning routine happened, teeth, face, hair, brushed until it stopped looking like a bird's nest. Emma narrated the entire process, explaining to Captain Hoppy why rabbits didn't need to brush teeth, but people did, her logic impeccable, even when her facts were creative. They drove to school in the pickup truck that burned oil and rattled over potholes but started reliably, which made it more trustworthy than most things in Marcus's life. The heater worked intermittently, breathing warm air in patterns that felt personal, like the truck was doing its best with limited resources. Emma pressed her face against the window, breath fogging the glass. She drew a star in the condensation, then a moon, then something that might have been a helicopter or might have been a particularly ambitious bird. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Rebecca used to do that, used to draw constellations on fogged windows, while Marcus drove them home from late shifts back when he'd been a pilot, back when the future included plans beyond surviving, until Emma's next medication refill. He pulled up to Cedar Ridge Elementary, watching Emma gather her backpack too large for her frame, stuffed with textbooks and the emergency inhaler, and the letter from her doctor explaining her condition to teachers who might not understand why she couldn't run in PE, couldn't play in cold weather, needed special accommodation for the simple act of being a child. Emma turned back, one foot on the ground, preparing to launch herself into another day of managing disability while pretending normalcy. Marcus nodded, the word carrying weight that Emma couldn't fully comprehend yet. Always meant picking her up from school, but also meant keeping her alive, meant making sure she grew up in a world where 7-year-olds with severe asthma could have futures that didn't end in emergency rooms. Emma ran toward the building, backpack bouncing. She turned once, waved. Marcus waved back. Then she disappeared into the flow of children and teachers and the ordinary chaos of elementary education. And Marcus was alone with silence and the drive to Cedar Ridge Air Traffic Control, where he'd spend another shift tracking aircraft he no longer flew, living in the shadow of the pilot he used to be. Cedar Ridge sprawled at the base of the Northern Rockies, small enough that everyone knew your business, and large enough that you could find privacy if you worked at it. Marcus had perfected invisibility over 3 years, becoming the night shift radar technician. Nobody noticed the former Marine who'd washed out of flying for reasons he didn't discuss and nobody asked about, because asking meant conversation, and conversation meant connection, and connection required energy nobody had after 40 hours of watching blips on screens. The control tower sat on a hill overlooking the valley, accessible by a winding road that turned treacherous in winter. Montana winters were biblical in their severity, blizzards that shut down the entire region for days, wind chills that killed the unprepared. Marcus had learned to respect winter in Afghanistan, where mountains taught lessons about hubris and frostbite, but Montana winter was different, longer, colder, more patient in its desire to kill you. Tom Harris met him at the entrance, 50-something former Army helicopter pilot who transitioned to air traffic control after a crash that left him with a limp and medical discharge. He handed Marcus the clipboard with the day's aircraft schedule, weather reports, the administrative detritus that defined modern aviation. Marcus scanned the list. One notation jumped out: Sky Horizon Aviation Test Flight, scheduled for 900 hours, Experimental Navigation System CEO on board for demonstration flight. Tom's voice carried the cautious tone of someone delivering news that might detonate. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Sky Horizon Aviation, the name that haunted every nightmare where Rebecca died over and over, the company whose defective navigation system had killed his wife and 2 other crew members in a crash officially attributed to pilot error, despite evidence that pilots like Marcus knew told a different story. Richard Sterling's company, the man who'd signed off on safety reports while knowing his navigation systems failed in cold weather, who'd prioritized profit over the lives of people who trusted his equipment. Richard Sterling was dead now, heart attack 2 years ago, but his company survived, and apparently his incompetence or corruption or whatever combination of human failure had killed Rebecca was still manufacturing helicopters. And now someone from that company was flying over Cedar Ridge in conditions that the weather report predicted would turn severe by mid-morning. Marcus kept his voice neutral. Tom studied him with the assessment of someone who'd shared enough military history to know that neutral tones often concealed rage. Marcus took the clipboard, walked to his station, sat down at the console that had been his entire world for 3 years. Radar screens glowed in the dimly lit room, each blip representing an aircraft, each aircraft carrying people who trusted that the machines they flew were safe, that the companies manufacturing those machines cared more about lives than quarterly earnings. He thought about Rebecca, about the last conversation they'd had before she'd boarded the medical transport helicopter that would kill her. She'd been excited about the mission, about bringing medical supplies to a remote clinic, about saving lives in the way that had defined her career as a trauma nurse. Marcus had kissed her goodbye, told her to fly safe, watched her walk away without knowing that goodbye was permanent. The investigation afterward had been thorough and useless. Pilot error, the report concluded. Navigation system malfunction, secondary to pilot failure to properly initialize equipment. Marcus had read the technical specifications, had reviewed the maintenance logs, had found the pattern that investigators either missed or ignored. Sky Horizon's LX-7 navigation system failed consistently in temperatures below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, a defect that multiple engineers had flagged and Richard Sterling had systematically buried. Marcus had tried to go public, had contacted reporters, lawyers, anyone who might care that a defense contractor was killing people through negligence. Sky Horizon's attorneys had buried him in paperwork, had threatened lawsuits, had made fighting them require resources Marcus didn't possess. The FAA had closed the case. Rebecca stayed dead. And Marcus had learned that justice was expensive and grief was cheap, and sometimes surviving meant walking away from fights you couldn't win. So he'd walked away from flying from the career that had defined him, from the Marines and rescue missions, and everything except Emma, who needed a father more than the world needed another pilot seeking revenge against corporations with infinite legal budgets. 3 years of walking away. 3 years of pretending Sky Horizon Aviation didn't exist. And now they were flying over his airspace, over the mountains where Rebecca had died, testing another navigation system that probably had defects they were probably ignoring, and Marcus was supposed to guide them safely through weather that was probably going to turn lethal. His hand hovered over the radio, preparing to call the tower supervisor to request reassignment to find someone else to track this particular aircraft. But reassignment meant explaining why, and explaining meant talking about Rebecca, and talking about Rebecca meant admitting that 3 years hadn't healed anything, had only buried the grief under routine and necessity. The shift began. Aircraft took off and landed routine traffic that required attention, but not thought. Marcus tracked them with the competence that came from 2 decades of aviation experience, guiding planes through approaches, confirming altitudes, performing the choreography that kept the sky organized and people alive. At 0830 hours, the weather report updated. The storm system moving in from the north was accelerating, expected to hit the mountains by 0930 hours instead of noon. Visibility would drop to near zero. Wind speeds would exceed safety margins for most aircraft, the kind of conditions that killed pilots who made poor decisions or flew equipment that failed at critical moments. Marcus keyed his radio to the general frequency. Acknowledgements came back from every aircraft in his sector, except one. Sky Horizon's test flight was still preparing for takeoff at their private airfield 20 miles south, apparently unconcerned with weather reports that suggested delaying until conditions improved. Marcus tried the direct frequency. Static answered. Then a voice, female, confident, carrying the kind of authority that came from corner offices and Harvard MBAs. The voice belonged to someone who believed in her equipment, who'd probably been assured by engineers that the new navigation system was flawless, who couldn't know that Rebecca had trusted similar assurances before climbing into a helicopter that had killed her. Marcus wanted to warn her, wanted to explain that Sky Horizon's safety record was written in blood, that her father's legacy was corpses, that the storm coming wasn't something you challenge with confidence and experimental equipment. But warnings required explanations, and explanations meant revealing that the professional radar technician guiding her flight was actually the widower of a woman her company had killed, and that revelation would help nobody. Marcus settled for professional courtesy. At 0857 hours, Sky Horizon's helicopter lifted off. Marcus watched the blip appear on radar, tracked its ascent, noted the flight path that would take it directly into the mountains where the storm was already building. The helicopter climbed steadily, following the approved route, the pilot Jake Morrison, according to the flight plan, handling the aircraft, with the competence that came from military training and thousands of flight hours. For 20 minutes, everything was routine. The helicopter maintained an altitude, responded to course corrections, behaved exactly as helicopters should behave when flown by professionals using functional equipment in marginal weather. Then the blip flickered. Marcus leaned forward, watching the radar signature destabilize. The helicopter's altitude dropped, suddenly recovered, dropped again. The pattern was familiar. Horrifyingly familiar, the same instability he'd seen in Rebecca's flight data before her helicopter had stopped responding entirely. Marcus keyed the emergency frequency. Static. Then fragments of transmission, Jake Morrison's voice breaking through interference. The transmission cut off. The radar blip flickered once more, then began falling, the controlled descent of powered flight, transforming into the uncontrolled plummet of aircraft that had lost all systems simultaneously. Marcus was already moving, grabbing his coat, running for his truck in the parking lot. Tom shouted something behind him, questions about protocols and procedures, and why Marcus was abandoning his post. Marcus didn't answer. Didn't have time to explain that he'd watched this exact scenario play out 3 years ago, that he'd been too far away to help Rebecca, but he was exactly 23 miles from where Sky Horizon's helicopter was going down, that some debts could only be paid by refusing to let history repeat itself. His truck roared to life, tires spitting gravel, as Marcus accelerated down the hill toward the mountain road. The storm was hitting now, snow beginning to fall and earnest visibility already compromised. Marcus drove faster than conditions warranted, muscle memory from combat deployments taking over the part of his brain that calculated risk versus necessity, deciding that crashing his truck would still be faster than waiting for emergency services to mobilize. The coordinates from the last radar contact were burned into his mind. Northridge, approximately 8,000 feet elevation, the exact area where Rebecca's helicopter had gone down. The coincidence felt deliberate, like the universe was giving him a second chance or testing whether he'd learned anything from the first failure. 20 minutes of driving through snow that was becoming a blizzard. The road deteriorated from paved to gravel to barely maintained track. Marcus's truck wasn't designed for this terrain, but neither was he, and both were managing through determination that bordered on stupidity. Then he saw its smoke rising above the tree line, black against white, the unmistakable signature of burning aviation fuel. Marcus abandoned the truck where the road ended, grabbed the medical kit he kept behind. The Sate ran toward the smoke through snow that was already knee-deep and rising. The wreckage appeared through the storm like a photograph developing. The helicopter had hit hard fuselage, crumpled rotors, sheared off, the kind of impact that meant survivors were unlikely. It lay on its side in a small clearing, flames consuming the engine compartment, spreading toward the cockpit where Marcus could see 2 figures still strapped in their seats. The pilot was dead. Marcus knew it before reaching the wreckage, recognized the posture of a body that had stopped being a person, the complete stillness that only death achieved. Jake Morrison had died on impact, neck, broken, the kind of instant death that was mercy compared to alternatives. But the co-pilot was moving. Weakly, barely, but moving meant alive. And alive meant Marcus had minutes before the fuel tank completed its ignition and turned the cockpit into a crematorium. He tore the door open, smoke pouring out, heat intense enough to blister exposed skin. The woman inside stared at him with eyes that were shock. Glazed but conscious, blood streaming from a gash on her temple, her face pale against the dark hair that had come loose from its professional arrangement. She was young, early 30s, wearing a business suit under the flight gear. Every detail suggesting someone important who'd made the catastrophic decision to personally test equipment that had just tried to kill her. Her voice was surprisingly strong given the circumstances, command presence intact, even while bleeding in a burning helicopter. Marcus didn't waste breath on arguments. He reached past her, unclipped the 5-point harness that held her to the seat, pulled her forward. She gasped in pain, ribs probably cracked, but Marcus couldn't afford gentleness. The fuel tank was going, the flames were spreading, and delicate rescue techniques required time they didn't have. He dragged her from the cockpit, feeling her weight against his chest, smelling smoke and blood and the aviation fuel that meant they had seconds, not minutes. His boots found purchase in the snow, carrying them away from the wreckage in a stumbling run that was more controlled fall than actual locomotion. The fuel tank ignited when they were 15 feet clear. The explosion threw them forward into snowdrift heat, rolling over them like a wave, Marcus covering the woman's body with his own because protecting strangers from explosions was apparently his specialty now. When the initial blast subsided, Marcus rolled off her, checked for breathing, for pulse, for signs that the rescue had been worth the burns on his hands and the ringing in his ears. She was alive. Unconscious now, shock and trauma and blood loss, catching up with adrenaline, but alive, breathing, survivable. Marcus pulled off his coat, wrapped it around her, lifted her in a fireman's carry that his back immediately protested. The nearest road was a quarter-mile downhill. His truck was there. He could get her to Cedar Ridge Medical Center in 30 minutes if he didn't stop to think about how this was impossible, how 45-year-old radar technicians didn't perform mountain rescues in blizzards, how he'd sworn never to touch another helicopter crash after Rebecca. The walk downhill was nightmare made physical. Snow fell harder, Marcus's visibility reduced to the few feet immediately ahead, his burdens seeming to increase in weight with every step. He fell twice, protected her body, both times kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant Emma would wake up tomorrow without a father, and that was unacceptable. His truck appeared through the storm like salvation. Marcus loaded the woman into the passenger seat, turned the heat to maximum, grabbed his phone to call emergency services. No signal. The storm was interfering with cell towers, or they were too deep in the mountains, or the universe was testing exactly how much one man could handle before breaking. Marcus drove. The road down was treacherous, his truck sliding on ice snow accumulating faster than his wipers could clear. The woman beside him remained unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady, blood from her head wound soaking into his coat. 25 minutes to reach Cedar Ridge Medical Center. Marcus carried her into the emergency room, deposited her on a gurney, answered the rapid-fire questions from triage nurses who wanted to know what happened, who she was, whether there were other victims. Marcus gave them coordinates for the crash site, described Jake Morrison's body, provided the technical details that would help search and rescue when the storm cleared. Then he excused himself, walked to his truck, sat in the driver's seat, while adrenaline drained away and left him shaking. He'd saved her. Had pulled someone from a burning Sky Horizon helicopter, had refused to let another person die because Richard Sterling's company valued innovation over safety. The knowledge should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt empty, like he'd won a battle in a war that had already been lost 3 years ago when Rebecca died. His phone buzz signal restored now that he was back in town. Multiple missed calls from Tom from the tower supervisor from numbers he didn't recognize. Marcus ignored them. He needed to pick up Emma from school in 2 hours. Needed to shower, to change clothes, to transform back into the father whose biggest challenge was affording asthma medication, not rescuing CEOs from helicopter crashes and blizzards. He drove home, stripped off smoke-damaged clothes, stood underwater that was never quite hot enough to wash away the smell of burning aviation fuel. His hands were blistered from tearing open the helicopter door, his back screaming from carrying an unconscious woman through a quarter-mile of snow, his lungs protesting smoke inhalation that probably needed medical attention he couldn't afford. But he was alive. The woman was alive. And in 2 hours he'd pick up Emma and pretend that today had been routine, that Daddy's job involved sitting at a desk instead of running into burning wreckage, that the world was safe enough for 7-year-olds with severe asthma to grow up in. Marcus, dressed in clean clothes, drove to Emma's school early, sat in the parking lot watching children emerge from the building. Emma spotted his truck, waved, ran toward him with the bouncing energy that suggested a good day. No asthma attacks, no problems beyond homework and playground politics. She climbed into the passenger seat, buckled her seatbelt, launched into an explanation of her day that involved science class and a boy named Tyler, who'd said rabbits couldn't swim, but Emma had informed him that rabbits were excellent swimmers and had the encyclopedia entry to prove it. Marcus listened, responded when appropriate, drove them home, while Emma narrated the entire journey, and Marcus tried not to think about the woman in the hospital, about whether she'd survive, about whether saving her counted as redemption or just delayed the inevitable. Next time Sky Horizon's equipment failed, they had dinner macaroni and cheese, Emma's favorite, cheap enough that Marcus could afford to make it properly instead of cutting corners. Emma did homework at the kitchen table, tongue poking out in concentration, while Marcus reviewed their finances and concluded that the rescue mission had cost him a shift's wages and he'd need to pick up overtime to compensate. At 8 p.m., Marcus tucked Emma into bed, placed her nebulizer within reach, checked that her emergency inhaler was on the nightstand. Emma held Captain Hoppy close, her eyes already drooping. Marcus sat on the edge of her bed. Emma smiled, sleepy and trusting. Marcus kissed her forehead, turned off the light, stood in the doorway watching her breathe. Some promises were easy to keep. Some required running into burning helicopters. Both mattered equally to 7-year-olds who just wanted their fathers to show up. His phone buzzed. Text from Tom Turn on the news. Marcus walked to his small television, turned it on. The local news was leading with the helicopter crash aerial footage from once the storm had cleared, showing the burned wreckage in the mountains. The anchor's voice carried appropriate gravity. The screen cut to hospital footage, reporters clustered outside Otter Ridge Medical Center. A woman appeared on screen, professional, composed despite the bandage on her forehead, wearing hospital scrubs, but carrying herself with authority that transcended circumstances. Marcus's blood went cold. The name hit him like a second explosion. Elena Sterling, Richard Sterling's daughter. The woman he'd just saved was the child of the man whose company had killed Rebecca, who'd covered up defects, who'd valued profit over the lives of people like Marcus's wife. The universe wasn't giving him a second chance. It was testing whether he'd learned that some debts couldn't be paid, that some coincidences were too cruel to be anything except cosmic jokes, that saving Elena Sterling didn't bring Rebecca back, didn't make the last 3 years worthwhile, didn't mean anything except that Marcus Reed was apparently fated to be tangled with Sky Horizon Aviation until one of them stopped existing. The reporter asked Elena about her rescue. She described a man appearing through the smoke, pulling her from the helicopter, carrying her to safety. Described him as a guardian angel, as someone who'd risked everything to save a stranger, as the kind of hero that renewed your faith in humanity. Marcus turned off the television. He wasn't a hero. He was a widower who'd failed to save his wife and had saved her killer's daughter by accident, by coincidence, by being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the right skills. Heroes made choices. Marcus had just reacted, had let training override judgment, had done what Marines did, because leaving people to die in burning helicopters wasn't something you could train yourself to accept, no matter how much you hated their families. His phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Marcus almost ignored it, then recognized the area code. Local, probably the hospital. A professional voice, female, tired. Marcus's heart rate spiked. Marcus absorbed this. Elena Sterling wanted to thank him personally, wanted to meet the man who'd saved her life, wanted to make this personal, when personal was the last thing Marcus could afford. The nurse's voice brightened. Marcus ended the call. Stood in his kitchen, surrounded by bills and asthma medication and Rebecca's photograph, and wondered what kind of conversation you had with the daughter of the man who'd killed your wife. Wondered whether you told her that her father was a murderer, that her company was built on corpses, that saving her life had been instinct overriding judgment, and he'd have made the same choice for anyone, but it didn't mean forgiveness, didn't mean reconciliation, didn't mean anything except that Marines didn't leave people to burn. He looked at Rebecca's photograph. The photograph didn't answer. Photographs never did. But Marcus heard Rebecca's voice anyway. The memory of 1,000 conversations about doing the right thing, even when the right thing cost you, about being the kind of person Emma could be proud of, about not letting grief transform you into something hollow and bitter and small. Marcus picked up his phone, texted the number the nurse had provided. He hit send before he could reconsider. Then he sat in the darkness of his apartment, listening to Emma breathe in the next room, and wondered what tomorrow would bring when he walked into Elena Sterling's hospital room and looked into the eyes of the woman whose father had destroyed his life. Some debts were paid in blood, some in years of silent service, some in the moment when you pulled someone from a burning helicopter, despite knowing exactly who they were, exactly what their family had cost you, exactly how much easier it would have been to walk away and let the universe balance its own scales. Marcus had chosen not to walk away. Now he'd have to live with that choice, whatever it meant, however it complicated the careful invisibility he'd built around himself and Emma. The snow continued falling outside, blanketing Cedar Ridge in white, covering the mountains where Rebecca had died and Elena had survived, erasing the boundaries between past and present until Marcus couldn't tell which was haunting him more. Tomorrow he'd find out. Tomorrow Elena Sterling would look at him and see a radar technician who'd saved her life. And Marcus would look at her and see Richard Sterling's daughter, Richard Sterling's legacy. Richard Sterling's company that was still manufacturing helicopters, that still had defects that would still kill people unless someone stopped them. Some wars never ended. Some just paused between battles, waiting for the next person to decide whether fighting was worth the cost. Marcus stood, checked on Emma one final time, then lay down on his mattress and stared at the ceiling until exhaustion pulled him under, into dreams where helicopters burned and Rebecca died over and over, and Elena Sterling asked him why he'd saved her when letting her die would have been so much simpler. He woke at 4:30 to the alarm scream, the same as always, except nothing was the same anymore, because invisibility had ended the moment he'd run into that storm, because saving Elena Sterling had made him visible in ways that couldn't be undone, because tomorrow he'd walk into that hospital room and the careful life he'd built for Emma would begin transforming into something he couldn't predict or control. Some choices you made. Some made you. Marcus was no longer certain which category applied to rescuing Richard Sterling's daughter from the same fate that had killed Rebecca Reed. Outside, Cedar Ridge slept. Inside, Marcus Reed prepared for war, the kind that was fought in hospital rooms and explanations, and the moment when you told someone that you'd saved their life but couldn't forgive their father, that heroism and hatred could coexist, that some debts transcended gratitude. The snow fell, the mountains waited, and in 18 hours Marcus would discover whether saving Elena Sterling was the beginning of something or the end of everything. Marcus stood outside Cedar Ridge Medical Center, watching snow begin to fall, each flake a reminder that winter in Montana didn't care about human complications. The text from the hospital nurse waited on his phone like an obligation he couldn't postpone. Elena Sterling wanted to meet the man who'd saved her life, wanted to thank him personally, wanted to make this personal when personal was exactly what Marcus had spent 3 years avoiding. He needed to pick up Emma from school in 40 minutes. Needed to figure out how to explain why the woman on television, the CEO whose helicopter crash had dominated local news, wanted to meet Daddy. Needed to reconcile the fact that Elena Sterling seemed genuinely grateful when her father's company had killed Rebecca, and Marcus wasn't certain gratitude was currency that could purchase forgiveness. His phone buzzed. Tom Harris, the tower supervisor, who'd been conspicuously absent since Marcus had abandoned his post to rescue Elena. Marcus ended the call without responding. The message was clear enough: come back to work and pretend yesterday never happened, or find employment elsewhere. The choice should have been simple. He had Emma to support medication, to afford bills that didn't care about principals or dead wives or the fact that Sky Horizon Aviation built helicopters that killed people. But simple choices were luxuries Marcus had stopped being able to afford 3 years ago, when Rebecca died and left him alone with a daughter who couldn't breathe, and a rage that had nowhere productive to go. He walked into the hospital, followed signs to the ICU, where Elena had been moved after emergency surgery to repair internal injuries. The elevator rose too slowly, giving Marcus time to rehearse conversations that all ended badly, scenarios where he told Elena exactly who he was, what her father had done, why saving her life didn't mean he forgave anything except physics in the Marine Corps training that refused to let people burn regardless of their surnames. The ICU floor was quiet with the artificial peace of places where people recovered or didn't. A nurse directed Marcus to room 307, her smile professional and warm, in ways that suggested she didn't know she was sending a widower to meet the daughter of the man who'd killed his wife. Elena was sitting up in bed when Marcus entered, looking remarkably composed for someone who'd survived a helicopter crash 18 hours earlier. The bandage on her forehead was white against dark hair, her left arm in a sling, but her eyes were alert, tracking Marcus with the assessment of someone who'd been CEO long enough to read people quickly and accurately. Marcus kept his response neutral, formal, the tone he'd perfected for maintaining distance. Elena gestured to the chair beside her bed with her uninjured arm. Marcus sat, maintaining the posture that came from 2 decades of military bearing, back straight, hands visible, expression carefully neutral. Elena studied him with uncomfortable intensity, the kind of focus that suggested she was cataloging details most people missed. Marcus felt the conversation shifting toward territory he needed to avoid. The question of why he'd been there, why a radar technician had abandoned his post to drive into a blizzard, required answers that would unravel everything Marcus had built over 3 years of careful invisibility. Elena's voice was quiet, no longer the confident CEO, but someone genuinely trying to understand their own survival. Marcus chose his words with the care he'd once used for mission briefings where imprecision got people killed. The lie came easier than truth. Marcus had learned in Afghanistan that sometimes the mission required deception, that protecting people occasionally meant letting them believe comfortable fictions instead of complicated realities. Elena wasn't convinced. Her eyes narrowed slightly, the expression of someone who'd spent years in boardrooms learning to detect when people were managing the truth instead of sharing it. Marcus deflected with the question he'd actually come to ask, the one that mattered more than philosophical debates about duty. Elena's expression shifted, sadness replacing suspicion. Marcus absorbed this feeling, the familiar rage that Preston Blackwell's name triggered. 3 years of believing Richard Sterling alone was responsible, and now learning that the corruption had survived, that Preston was continuing the legacy that had killed Rebecca. Elena's voice strengthened, losing the weakness that pain and gratitude had softened. Marcus wanted to tell her, wanted to explain that he knew exactly how her navigation system had failed, because he'd watched the same failure kill his wife, that her father's company had a pattern of covering up defects, that Preston Blackwell wasn't just incompetent, but was actively murderous. But telling her required revealing who he was, and revealing who he was meant ending the invisibility that protected Emma from complications Marcus couldn't afford. The decision was made when Marcus's phone buzzed with the alarm reminding him to pick up Emma. He stood already moving toward the door. Elena's voice stopped him at the threshold. Marcus turned back, saw her holding out a business card embossed with Sky Horizon Aviation's logo, the same logo that had been on the wreckage that killed Rebecca, the same company Marcus had sworn to never touch again. Elena's voice was firm, despite the pain medication that made her words slightly slurred. Marcus took the card, slipped it into his pocket, nodded once and walked out, before she could see his expression shift from neutral to the barely controlled rage that Preston Blackwell's existence triggered. He drove to Emma's school faster than conditions warranted, mind racing through scenarios that all ended with Elena Sterling discovering who Marcus really was, what her father's company had cost him, how complicated gratitude became when it crossed paths with grief. Emma emerged from the building wrapped in her winter coat backpack, bouncing no visible wheeze today, which meant a good day, no attacks, no crisis. She climbed into the truck, buckled her seatbelt, launched into an explanation of her day that involved art class and a painting of stars that the teacher said showed real promise. Marcus drove toward home, half listening to Emma's narration, until his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Reed, this is Elena Sterling. I did some research after you left. Marine Corps Force Recon, decorated combat veteran, transitioned to civilian aviation, then stopped flying 3 years ago. Same year my father died. Same year a medical transport helicopter crashed, killing 3 people, including a trauma nurse named Rebecca Reed. Your wife. I understand now why you were there yesterday, why you saved me knowing who I am. I need to talk to you about Preston, about what he's still doing, please." Marcus pulled over to the side of the road, hands gripping the steering wheel, hard enough to make his knuckles white. Emma stopped talking mid-sentence, her 7-year-old instincts recognizing that Daddy was upset in ways that required silence. The text sat on his screen like an accusation and an invitation. Elena Sterling knew, had figured out the connection, had done the research that competent CEOs did when something didn't make sense, had drawn the lines between Marcus's past and her present with uncomfortable accuracy. Emma's small hand touched his arm. Marcus looked at his daughter, blonde hair, blue eyes, Rebecca's face asking him, with Marcus's caution, the genetic combination that made Emma the most important thing in a world full of things that wanted to hurt her. He couldn't lie to Emma, had never lied to her, had promised Rebecca on her deathbed that their daughter would grow up knowing truth even when truth was complicated and painful. Emma processed this with the gravity she brought to everything. Marcus resumed driving, not toward home, but toward Kate Morgan's temporary apartment. If Elena Sterling wanted to talk about Preston, if she'd connected Marcus to Rebecca's death, then invisibility was no longer an option. The careful life Marcus had built was transforming into something he couldn't predict, and Emma deserved to be somewhere safe when that transformation completed itself. Kate answered her door, still wearing the professional suit from work, Lily visible behind her in pajamas, despite it being only 5 p.m. Kate's eyes widened, seeing Marcus's expression, the barely controlled rage that must have been visible, despite his attempts at maintaining composure. Kate pulled them inside without questions, her hand on Marcus's arm grounding in ways he didn't have words for. Lily appeared and immediately took Emma's hand, the two girls disappearing into Lily's room with the kind of instant friendship that children forged effortlessly. Marcus showed Kate the text from Elena, watched her read it twice, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something that looked like determination. Kate was already moving, pulling out her own phone, making a call. Within minutes, she'd arranged a meeting. Elena would come to the apartment once discharged from the hospital, bringing whatever evidence she had about Preston, and they'd figure out together how to stop a man who'd already killed 6 people and was apparently prepared to kill more. The wait was 2 hours. Marcus spent it pacing Kate's small living room, while Emma and Lily played in the next room, their laughter a reminder that some people still lived in worlds where helicopter crashes were abstract tragedies instead of personal catastrophes. Kate brought him coffee that Marcus didn't drink, sat beside him on the couch with the kind of companionable silence that came from understanding that some situations didn't require conversation, only presence. Finally, Kate spoke. Marcus thought about that question, about the 3 years he'd spent invisible, about whether staying invisible had protected Emma or just delayed the inevitable moment when the past demanded accounting. Kate's hand found his squeezed, once released. The gesture was support without pressure, and acknowledgement without requiring response. Elena arrived at 7 p.m. still wearing hospital scrubs, moving carefully with the stiffness that came from cracked ribs and internal injuries that were healing but not healed. She carried a laptop bag that looked incongruous against the medical setting. She looked at Marcus first, then at Kate, recognition clicking into place. Kate extended her hand with the professionalism that came from corner offices and Harvard MBAs. Elena shook it, then turned to Marcus. Marcus's throat was tight. The apology was genuine, carried weight that transcended corporate liability, but apologies didn't resurrect the dead or erase 3 years of grief. Elena set her laptop on the coffee table, opened files that made Kate lean forward with sudden intensity. Engineering reports showing navigation system defects, email chains where Preston dismissed concerns, financial records showing payments to shell companies, and most damning, a video file dated 2 weeks before Elena's crash. The video showed Preston in his office speaking to someone off camera. The voice was male, uncertain. Preston's response was cold. The video cut off. Elena's face was pale, her hands shaking slightly as she closed the laptop. Kate's voice was barely controlled. Elena shook her head. Understanding arrived with the weight of all Marcus's failures. David Morgan, Kate's husband. The Marine who'd served with Marcus, who died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan 2 years ago, who Marcus had mourned as a brother lost to war. Except it hadn't been war. It had been Preston Blackwell, continuing Richard Sterling's legacy of valuing profit over lives of murdering people who threatened quarterly earnings. Marcus's vision narrowed rage building with the kind of cold focus that had once made him effective in situations where effectiveness meant controlled violence. Preston Blackwell had killed Rebecca, had killed David, had killed 5 other engineers, and was apparently prepared to kill more. Kate was crying now, quiet tears that spoke of grief renewed and rage given direction. Elena sat across from them, the daughter of the man who'd started this legacy of corruption, looking at the woman who'd lost her husband and the man who'd lost his wife, and understanding finally the true cost of her father's decisions. Marcus's phone shattered the moment. Unknown number. His hand moved to decline the call, then stopped, seeing the area code Cedar Ridge Elementary School. The principal's voice was professional but urgent. Marcus's world stopped. The rage transformed into something colder, more focused. Preston Blackwell had just threatened his daughter, had made this personal in ways that transcended business or justice or any consideration, except that Emma was 7 years old with severe asthma and was now a target because Marcus had saved Elena Sterling. Marcus ended the call, was moving toward the door before conscious thought completed. Kate was beside him instantly. Elena struggled to her feet despite obvious pain. Marcus paused at the door looking at these two women who'd lost husbands to Preston's corruption, who were offering to stand beside him despite knowing that Preston had resources and connections and the kind of sociopathic willingness to threaten children that made him genuinely dangerous. They drove in Kate's car. Marcus couldn't trust himself behind the wheel. The rage was too consuming, too focused on getting to Emma before Preston's threat materialized into action. Kate drove faster than conditions warranted. Elena Mo in the back seat, making phone calls to lawyers and police and anyone who might create consequences for men who threaten children. Cedar Ridge Elementary was in lockdown when they arrived, police cars outside, teachers standing at windows, the principal visible at the entrance, looking relieved when Marcus ran toward her. The principal led Marcus to her office, where Emma sat with the school counselor holding Captain Hoppy, her face tear-stained but otherwise unharmed. Marcus dropped to his knees, pulled his daughter into his arms, felt her small body shaking with delayed terror. Emma's voice was muffled against his shoulder. Marcus held her tighter, rage and relief warring in his chest. The man hadn't touched Emma, had shown her a photograph of their apartment taken from inside, had explained that he knew where she lived, where she slept, what medication she took, had told a 7-year-old girl that her father needed to stop asking questions or accidents happened. Kate appeared in the doorway, with Lily, the two girls immediately gravitating together. Elena spoke with the principal in low, urgent tones, getting descriptions promising lawyers and consequences, and everything money could provide to protect children from men like Preston Blackwell. The police took statements. Marcus provided physical descriptions that were useless: average height, average build, the kind of forgettable appearance that contractors cultivated professionally. The man had left before teachers could intervene, had vanished into Cedar Ridge's afternoon crowds like the professional he clearly was. Marcus drove home with Emma silent beside him, Kate following in her own car, Elena making more calls, arranging security and lawyers and the machinery that wealthy people deployed when threats became personal. The apartment felt violated despite showing no signs of entry, the knowledge that Preston's people had been inside, poisoning the space with paranoia that wouldn't dissipate. Marcus packed bags for himself and Emma with the efficiency that came from military deployments, essentials only, fast, decisive. Emma watched from her bed, holding Captain Hoppy, understanding that their life was changing in ways that 7-year-olds couldn't fully comprehend, but could sense with uncomfortable accuracy. Kate's voice came from the doorway, gentle but firm. Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to maintain the independence that had defined 3 years of single parenting. But independence was luxury he couldn't afford when Emma's safety required resources Marcus didn't have. They drove to Kate's house, the real house, not the temporary apartment, the substantial home on Cedar Ridge's north side where Kate and David had built a life before helicopters and corruption had destroyed it. Security was better here, the house itself more defensible, and Lily was already there, which meant Emma would have company that wasn't defined by fear. Colonel James Winters arrived at Kate's house past midnight, carrying files and authority that transcended retirement. 62, gray-haired, still moving with military bearing that 2 decades of civilian life hadn't eroded. He embraced Marcus with the fierce brevity of warriors acknowledging survival. Marcus told him everything. About Elena's crash, about David's video, about Preston threatening Emma, about the accumulated weight of 3 years' invisible grief, transforming into focused rage that needed direction before it consumed him. Winters listened without interrupting the discipline of command presence that made men trust him with their lives. When Marcus finished, Winters pulled out files. Marcus recognized service records, classified mission reports, the accumulated documentation of Marcus Reed's 20 years as a Marine. Winters tapped the files. Marcus absorbed that. Surveillance that had never stopped, agencies that tracked valuable operators, even after discharge, the reality that some skills made you permanent asset regardless of civilian status. Winters continued, his voice carrying weight of shared history. Marcus felt understanding arrive cold and complete. David's death hadn't been covered up through simple bribery. It had been buried under classified stamps and national security justifications that made investigations impossible because exposing the defect would expose operations that relied on those helicopters. The system had protected Preston's profits while men died, had used patriotism and secrecy as justification to bury truth that inconvenienced people with power. Winters' voice carried steel underneath empathy. They planned through the night while Emma and Lily slept upstairs. Kate provided access codes and building layouts and board member files. Winters coordinated FBI contacts who owed him favors. Elena made calls to journalists who specialized in corporate corruption. Marcus provided the tactical assessment, how to force Preston's confession, how to create conditions where arrogance became liability, how to make a sociopath believe he'd won long enough to make the mistakes that overconfident people inevitably made. The plan had obvious holes. Every plan had holes. But alternatives all involved letting Preston continue killing people, and that was unacceptable to everyone in the room. At 3 a.m., Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, small and sleep-rumpled, holding Captain Hoppy. Marcus climbed the stairs to her, knelt at the landing. Emma's voice was quiet, that 7-year-old wisdom that sometimes exceeded adult comprehension. Marcus pulled her close, feeling her heart beat against his chest, feeling the slight wheeze in her breathing that meant her asthma was elevated by stress. Emma pulled back, looked at him with Rebecca's eyes and Rebecca's face, asking the question that had to be asked. Marcus thought about lying, about giving Emma the comfortable fiction that adults used to protect children from harsh realities. But he'd promised Rebecca to never lie to their daughter, and that promise superseded comfort. Emma nodded, processing this with the seriousness that chronically ill children learned early, understanding that some things in life were dangerous and unavoidable and required facing despite fear. Marcus carried her back to bed, tucked her in beside Lily, who was already asleep. Emma's hand found his before he could leave. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, holding his daughter's hand in the darkness, while Winters and Kate and Elena planned downstairs, while Preston Blackwell presumably slept soundly, believing that threatening children was effective strategy, while the universe arranged pieces that would determine whether justice could be achieved or only attempted. Emma's breathing deepened into sleep. Marcus sat for long minutes, watching her, memorizing her face, acknowledging that tomorrow he'd wear his Marine Corps dress blues and walk into Morgan Aviation's board meeting as himself, decorated veteran, invisible guardian widower, seeking accountability from men who'd killed his wife and threatened his daughter. Some wars ended through politics or diplomacy, some through exhaustion or stalemate, and some, the rarest kind, ended through moments of absolute clarity when the person with the most to lose decided that losing while fighting mattered more than winning through surrender. Marcus descended the stairs to find Kate and Winters still planning, Elena asleep on the couch, her laptop open, showing financial records that would destroy Preston if prosecutors could connect them to actual crimes. Kate looked up as Marcus entered, her expression carrying questions she didn't voice. Marcus thought of Emma upstairs, of Rebecca, 3 years dead, of David, who'd served beside him and died because Preston valued quarterly profits over lives. Thought of the choice that wasn't really a choice because Marines didn't leave people behind, even when behind meant ghosts demanding accountability. Kate's hand found his in the darkness between planning and dawn. They stood together, watching windows lighten toward morning, toward the board meeting where Preston would believe he'd won, toward the confrontation that would determine whether justice could survive contact with corruption or only document its failure. Emma appeared at dawn, holding Captain Hoppy, her breathing slightly labored despite morning medication, stress manifesting in the wheezing that Marcus had learned to fear. She climbed into his lap, small and warm and alive, the daughter who trusted him to keep promises even when promises required risking everything. Emma's voice was quiet but firm, 7-year-old giving permission her father needed. Marcus held her, feeling her breathe against his chest, feeling the slight wheeze that meant her lungs were fighting even now. Thought about the choice Preston had made, threatening this child, about the moment when corruption became personal instead of abstract, about why good men did terrible things to protect daughters who couldn't protect themselves. Some promises you made, some you kept, and some, the most important kind, you honored by becoming whatever person was necessary to ensure that 7-year-olds with severe asthma could grow up in worlds where men like Preston Blackwell faced consequences instead of enabling them. Winters appeared in the doorway carrying Marcus's dress, blues, freshly pressed metals gleaming. The uniform that Marcus had buried 3 years ago, that represented the warrior he'd tried to stop being, that some situations demanded wearing regardless of cost. Marcus dressed in Kate's guest room, transforming from invisible security guard to decorated Marine, watching himself become visible in ways that couldn't be undone. The Navy Cross gleamed above his breast pocket, second only to Medal of Honor, earned in circumstances that remain classified. Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster, Bronze Star with V device, each medal marking moments when survival hadn't been guaranteed but had been achieved through skill and luck and brotherhood that transcended individual survival. He emerged to find Emma staring her eyes wide. Marcus knelt, bringing himself to eye level with his daughter. Emma touched the medals with reverence, then wrapped her arms around his neck. Marcus held her, memorizing the weight, the warmth, the trust that children gave parents who kept promises. Then he stood, kissed her forehead, handed her to Kate, who would keep both girls safe while Marcus walked into Morgan Aviation and ended the war that had started 3 years ago when Rebecca died and Marcus had learned that justice was expensive and grief was cheap, and sometimes survival meant walking away from fights you couldn't win. Except he wasn't walking away anymore, wasn't staying invisible, wasn't pretending that radar technicians who'd once been Marines could watch corporations kill people and do nothing except survive another day. Preston Blackwell had made this personal, had threatened Emma, had forced the choice that transformed survival into warfare. And Marines, even retired Marines, even invisible Marines, even Marines who'd spent 3 years pretending they weren't warriors, didn't leave people behind, didn't ignore threats, didn't let sociopaths murder good people and threaten children without consequences. Marcus looked at Kate, at Elena, at Winters, who'd commanded him through situations where command meant the difference between mission success and body bags. Looked at Emma holding Lily's hand, both girls understanding that something important was happening, but not comprehending the full weight of adults preparing for confrontation that might end careers or lives. The words felt true and complete and terrifying. They drove to Morgan Aviation in Winter's vehicle, Marcus in the passenger seat, Elena and Kate in back, all moving toward Convergence, where Preston Blackwell waited, believing he'd already won, where boards and cameras and evidence would determine whether truth could survive contact with corruption or only document its inadequacy. Marcus's phone buzzed one final time before they arrived. Text from Emma, sent from Kate's phone. "Love you, Daddy. Do the Marine thing. Emma and Captain Hoppy." Marcus smiled despite everything. The Marine thing. His daughter's shorthand for courage and duty and doing what needed doing regardless of cost. Some promises you kept by staying safe. Some you kept by walking into danger. And some, the promises that mattered most, you kept by refusing to let fear dictate action, by choosing protection over survival, by accepting that Marines never stopped being Marines even when peacetime made warfare seem abstract instead of necessary. The glass tower of Morgan Aviation appeared ahead, reflecting dawn light, waiting for the moment when invisible men became visible and forced reckonings that powerful people had spent years avoiding. Marcus Reed, decorated Marine radar technician, invisible guardian, adjusted his uniform one final time and prepared to walk into the building where Preston Blackwell would learn what happened when corruption threatened the wrong veteran's daughter. The war was ending, or beginning. They are transforming into whatever shape justice took when good men stopped being invisible and demanded accountability from those who'd believed their power made them immune to consequences. Emma was safe. Rebecca was avenged. David would be honored. And Preston Blackwell was about to discover that some debts could only be paid through the complete dismantling of empires built on corpses. The sun rose over Cedar Ridge. The tower doors opened, and Marcus Reed walked toward the reckoning that 3 years of invisible grief had made inevitable. 5 a.m. arrived with the weight of inevitability. Marcus, dressed in his Marine Corps dress blues, each piece of the uniform a transformation from invisible technician to decorated warrior. The Eagle Globe and anchor gleamed above medals that told stories civilians couldn't read: Navy Cross Purple, Heart with Oak Leaf Cluster, Bronze Star with V device. The man in the mirror was a stranger Marcus had tried to bury, but burying the past required staying invisible, and invisibility had ended the moment he'd pulled Elena Sterling from burning wreckage. His phone buzzed with confirmations. Elena ready, Winters coordinating FBI positioning, all pieces moving toward Convergence at Morgan Aviation's board meeting, where Preston Blackwell believed he had already won. Let him feel secure. Arrogance was tactical advantage, the kind that made enemies careless at moments when care meant survival. Marcus drove through Cedar Ridge's empty streets, sunrise still hidden behind storm clouds that promised snow by afternoon. His truck passed Emma's school, dark quiet, his daughter safe at Winters Ranch, while her father walked into confrontation that might end with arrest or vindication in ratios Marcus couldn't predict. Morgan Aviation appeared on the horizon glass and steel catching first light. Kate's car occupied the executive space. She emerged wearing a tailored suit, hair pulled back every inch the CEO except for fear that only combat veterans recognize the controlled terror of walking into ambush while pretending confidence. Kate's eyes widened slightly at Marcus's transformation from security director to decorated Marine. They entered together through the main entrance where Marcus had once walked invisible. Jerry, the lobby guard, nearly dropped his coffee, seeing the uniform, the medals, the bearing that announced this wasn't a man you dismissed. The elevator rose in silence. Kate's breathing was measured, forced calm before high-stakes confrontation. Marcus had heard similar breathing from pilots before flying into hostile airspace, from Marines before kicking doors in Fallujah, from everyone who'd ever walked toward danger, knowing return wasn't guaranteed. The executive conference room occupied the top floor, glass walls providing panoramic views of mountains where Rebecca had died and Elena had survived. 8 board members sat around the table, venture capitalists, former executives, military brass, who traded service for lucrative advisory positions. They looked up as Kate entered, expressions ranging from sympathetic to calculating. Preston Blackwell sat at the head of the table, smiling with practiced warmth, layered over contempt. 55, distinguished, silver hair, custom suit that cost more than Marcus earned in half a year. His eyes tracked Kate, then shifted to Marcus, and something flickered there. Recognition, perhaps, or the first whisper of concern that the security guard he'd threatened was presenting in full military dress. Kate took her seat, placed her briefcase on the table with deliberate precision. Marcus positioned himself behind her at parade rest, hands, clasped, expression neutral. He'd attended enough military briefings to understand power dynamics at play. Preston controlled this room through alliances and intimidation. Kate needed to shatter that control decisively. Harrison, the oldest board member, Vietnam veteran, who carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd seen actual combat and studied Marcus with open curiosity. Kate's voice was steady, stronger than Marcus expected given the circumstances. She opened the briefcase, distributed folders around the table. Each contained copies of David's evidence, engineering reports showing known defects, email chains, proving Preston knew financial records tracing payments to shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Board members opened folders, expressions shifting from polite attention to confusion to alarm as they processed what they were reading. Preston's smile cracked, replaced by something harder, more calculating. Preston stood face flushing with indignation that was half performance, half genuine rage at being challenged. Kate pulled out her phone, connected it to the conference room's display system. David's video filled the wall, her husband bloodied, recording his final testimony from a helicopter that would kill him within hours. The room went silent as David's voice described the defect, named Preston, specifically detailed the cover-up with the precision of someone who knew he was creating evidence that would only matter if he died. The video ended. David's face frozen on screen, eyes accusing every person in the room. Preston's composure shattered completely. The confession hung in air, charged with shock. Marcus saw it register on every face, the admission of murder, spoken in rage but captured on recording, witnessed by 8 board members and transmitted via Kate's phone to FBI surveillance positioned 3 blocks away. Harrison stood slowly, face pale with disgust. Preston seemed to realize his error. His eyes darted toward the door, toward Marcus, blocking the exit, toward windows that offered no escape from consequences. Kate's voice cut through chaos with cold finality. The conference room door opened. FBI Special Agent Maria Santos entered, flanked by tactical teams, credentials raised, warrant in hand. Preston lunged toward the window, not to escape, but for the briefcase on the credenza containing files he couldn't let investigators see. Marcus moved faster, intercepting, controlling Preston's arm with a restrained hold that looked gentle but was pounds of pressure from breaking bones. Preston struggled, face contorted with fury and fear. Marcus leaned close, voice quiet enough that only Preston heard. FBI agents applied handcuffs, read rights. Preston was pulled from the room, still shouting threats about lawyers and consequences, still failing to understand that arrogance wasn't armor against evidence. The board members sat stunned. Harrison found his voice first, addressing Kate with respect that had been absent minutes earlier. Kate nodded, exhausted but standing. Marcus remained at parade rest, watching sunrise illuminate mountains beyond the glass, watching Cedar Ridge wake to news that would dominate headlines. Santos approached Marcus, extended her hand with the professional courtesy of one operator to another. Outside news vans were gathering, tipped off by press releases Winters had arranged. Preston's perp walk would be broadcast live, his face on every screen, his legacy destroyed. Public humiliation for public crimes, justice that couldn't be buried. Kate stood beside Marcus at the window, watching Preston being loaded into a federal vehicle. Marcus thought of David, of Rebecca, of the 5 other engineers whose deaths had been dismissed as accidents. Thought of Emma safe at the ranch, of all the children who would grow up in a slightly more just world because Preston Blackwell had been stopped. Harrison approached, cleared his throat with military formality. Kate's response was immediate and unanimous. The board voted Marcus Reed as director of security, with salary that meant Emma's medication would never again be a source of midnight calculations. The press conference happened 2 hours later. Kate detailed everything: David's murder, Preston's conspiracy, the cover-up that had cost 6 lives. She named Marcus, described his role, called him a hero in straightforward language that made Marcus uncomfortable because heroes were supposed to feel heroic instead of exhausted. When reporters demanded Marcus join her, he approached reluctantly, every instinct screaming to avoid visibility. Marcus kept his answer simple, thinking of Emma watching this eventually. They retreated to Kate's office after stood in silence processing that one war had ended. Preston arrested, truth exposed. Justice served, however delayed. But the relief lasted exactly 8 minutes before Kate's phone rang. Her face went white, listening to the voice on the other end. Kate's hand trembled, holding the phone. Marcus was already moving, grabbing his coat, the warrior instinct that had never stopped training him. Kate was right behind him. They ran to the helipad, where Morgan Aviation's fleet sat idle. The rescue helicopter properly maintained, no defects. Everything Preston should have ensured from the beginning waited with rotors still. A small crowd had gathered. Engineers, pilots, maintenance crews, all standing useless because pilots with families didn't fly into Category 2 blizzards for solo test flights that never should have happened. One pilot, Derek, 40-something, competent but sensible, shook his head when Kate asked. Kate offered double, triple, every incentive except the one that mattered: guarantee of survival. Marcus stared at the helicopter, at the machine that represented everything he'd sworn to never touch again. 3 years since he'd flown. 3 years since he'd promised Emma that Daddy's flying days were over, that she wouldn't lose another parent to aviation. But somewhere in those mountains, Ryan Mitchell was dying. The same way Rebecca had died, the same way Elena had almost died. And Marcus was the only person standing in this crowd who had the skills and the stupidity to fly into conditions that killed cautious people. His phone was in his hand before conscious thought completed. Emma answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the innocence of 7-year-olds who didn't know their fathers were about to do something catastrophically dangerous. Marcus chose honesty because lying to Emma had never been acceptable. Silence. Then Emma's voice, smaller now, but carrying steel that was pure Rebecca. Marcus closed his eyes. Emma's voice was fierce now, the 7-year-old giving permission her father needed, even though she didn't understand the full weight of what she was granting. Marcus ended the call before emotion made him reconsider. He turned to find Elena standing beside Kate, her face pale but determined, the bandage on her forehead, a reminder that she'd already survived one crash this week. Elena's voice carried the same steel her father had probably used to build his empire, except directed toward courage instead of corruption. Marcus tried the rational argument. Elena was already climbing into the co-pilot seat. Marcus looked at Kate, at the woman who'd become something more than his employer over months of careful courtship. Her eyes were wet. Marcus climbed into the pilot seat. The controls felt alien and familiar, simultaneously, 3 years dissolving as muscle memory took over. Pre-flight checks happened automatically, fuel instruments, communications, the ritual that had kept him alive through 2 decades of flying machines into situations where machines wanted to fail. The rotors began spinning. Elena buckled her harness, her hands steady, despite what had to be terror at climbing into another helicopter so soon after surviving a crash. Marcus's voice carried the calm he'd perfected before combat missions. The helicopter lifted off. Cedar Ridge dropped away below them, the town becoming a grid, then a map, then insignificant against the vastness of mountains where winter was already building toward lethal intensity. They flew north, following Ryan Mitchell's last known coordinates. The storm was visible as a wall of white advancing from the peaks, the kind of weather system that made experienced pilots turn back and inexperienced pilots die. Marcus flew toward it with the certainty that had once made him valuable, the ability to calculate risk versus necessity and choose necessity when necessity meant someone survived. Elena's voice broke the cockpit silence. Marcus kept his eyes on instruments on the horizon that was beginning to disappear into white. Elena was quiet for several moments. The storm hit them at minute 12. Visibility dropped to near zero, snow battering the windshield faster than wipers could clear. Wind shoved them sideways, Marcus correcting constantly, fighting weather that wanted to slam them into mountains, whose positions were theoretical, now that visual reference had vanished. Elena gripped the armrest, knuckles white, but her voice remained steady. Marcus told her the truth because lying in crisis situations got people killed. They flew deeper into conditions that violated every safety protocol Marcus had ever learned. The helicopter shook, buffeted by wind that felt personal in its violence. Ice began forming on the rotors, adding weight, changing aerodynamics in ways that made crashes probable rather than possible. Then Marcus saw its smoke rising through snow, the signature of Ryan Mitchell's helicopter burning in a narrow canyon below. The crash site was surrounded by rock walls, the kind of terrain that made landing nearly impossible and hovering suicidal in these winds. Marcus brought them down anyway, fighting for every foot of altitude, lost correcting for wind shear that wanted to spin them into the canyon walls. Elena watched without comment, understanding that talking would break concentration. Marcus needed to not kill them both. They reached hover position above the crash site. Ryan Mitchell was visible through the snow, collapsed against a boulder, his flight suit dark with blood that looked black against white snow. Marcus studied the terrain, calculating angles that didn't favor success. Elena's voice was firm. Marcus looked at her, saw David's determination in her eyes, saw the woman who'd chosen to fly after surviving a crash because some convictions required accepting risk. He lowered the rescue line. Elena clipped into the harness without hesitation, gave him a thumbs up, and dropped out of the helicopter into wind that swung her like a pendulum. Marcus watched her descend through snow and chaos, watched her reach Ryan, check his vitals, secure him in the harness. The rescue seemed straightforward until the weight calculations betrayed them. With Ryan secured and Elena preparing to signal ascent, the helicopter's altitude gauge began dropping. Ice on the rotors, combined with the weight of two people on the line, exceeded performance margins. Marcus's voice was calm despite circumstances. Elena's response came after a pause that felt eternal. The words hit Marcus with the force of the explosion that had thrown him into snow 3 days ago. Rebecca's voice echoing across years, the same desperate command to leave her, to save himself, to let mathematics dictate morality. Marcus had obeyed 3 years ago. Had left Rebecca to burn because she was already dead, and staying would have meant dying beside her. Had lived with that choice every day since, wondering if there'd been some impossible way to save her, some calculation he'd missed in the chaos. He wasn't making that choice again. Marcus locked the controls, clipped into a secondary safety line, dropped down beside Elena into wind that wanted to kill them all. The helicopter groaned above rotors, screaming against ice and weight and physics that didn't care about courage. Elena stared at him through snow and disbelief. Marcus pulled Ryan into his arms with one hand, wrapped his other arm around Elena, signaled the winch. The motor engaged, straining against weight that exceeded design specifications. They rose inch by terrible inch, the helicopter tilting dangerously above them. Altitude dropping toward the point where ascent became impossible. Elena was crying now, face pressed against Marcus's shoulder. Marcus held them both, Ryan unconscious and bleeding. Elena terrified but alive, while the helicopter fought to maintain position against wind that wanted to slam them into canyon walls. The winch pulled them upward through conditions that made survival theoretical rather than guaranteed. They cleared the canyon rim with feet to spare. Marcus hauled them all into the cabin, unclipped, scrambled back to the pilot's seat where the controls were screaming warnings. Altitude critical, ice accumulation severe, engine temperature approaching failure threshold. Marcus didn't think. He flew on instinct and muscle memory and the accumulated knowledge of 2 decades making helicopters do things they weren't designed to do. The helicopter limped out of the canyon, gained altitude through sheer stubbornness, turned towards Cedar Ridge through a storm that was still trying to kill them. Elena worked on Ryan in the back, pressure on wounds, checking vitals, performing emergency medicine with supplies from the helicopter's kit. Her voice provided updates that Marcus barely processed, focused entirely on keeping them airborne through conditions that were violating every flight principle he had ever learned. At minute 37, the helicopter's engine coughed. Not failed, but the warning that failure was approaching faster than Cedar Ridge. Marcus calculated distances, altitudes, glide ratios that assumed losing power over terrain that offered few landing options. Elena's voice from the back was too calm, the false calm that meant she understood they might not survive the next 10 minutes. Marcus spotted a clearing ahead, small, rough, but flat enough for emergency landing if he could reach it before the engine quit entirely. He aimed for it with the concentration that had once made him valuable, that had kept him alive through situations where survival seemed optional. The engine failed at minute 39. The helicopter transitioned from powered flight to controlled descent, Marcus adjusting angles to maximize glide to bleed speed without losing control to hit the clearing instead of the trees surrounding it. They impacted hard but survivable skids, collapsing fuselage tilting, but the critical systems staying intact. Marcus killed the remaining power, secured the controls, turned to check on Elena and Ryan. Ryan was still breathing. Elena was crying but functional, and they were on the ground, damaged but alive in a clearing where search and rescue could find them once weather permitted. Marcus pulled out his emergency beacon, activated it, then sat back in the pilot seat, feeling every one of his 45 years plus interest. Elena's voice was shaking. Marcus looked at her, at David's daughter, who'd just survived her second helicopter crash in 3 days, who'd volunteered to be lowered into a blizzard to save a stranger who'd told him to leave her when mathematics suggested saving her was impossible. Elena was staring at him with something that transcended gratitude, that looked like understanding or revelation, or the moment when you realized the person beside you was exactly who they needed to be. Search and rescue found them 2 hours later. Ryan Mitchell was airlifted to Cedar Ridge Medical with injuries that were severe but survivable. The helicopter was a write-off, damaged beyond repair, but machines were replaceable in ways that people weren't. The news crews were waiting when Marcus and Elena landed at Morgan Aviation. Cameras captured them emerging from the rescue helicopter, both exhausted, both bloodied, both alive against odds that had strongly favored alternative outcomes. A reporter shouted questions. Elena answered with the composure that came from corner offices and Harvard MBAs, explaining that Marcus Reed had just saved 3 lives, including her own, for the second time in 72 hours, that he'd flown into conditions that had killed less skilled pilots, that heroism was an inadequate word for what she'd witnessed. Marcus declined comment, uncomfortable with cameras, but understanding their necessity in making Preston's arrest stick and proving that Morgan Aviation, under Kate's leadership, valued lives over profit. Winters met them at the hangar, embraced Marcus with the fierce brevity of warriors acknowledging survival that wasn't guaranteed. Marcus managed something between laugh and sob. They drove to the ranch where Emma waited. Marcus needed to see his daughter to prove to himself that promises could be kept even when keeping them required flying into storms that killed cautious people. Emma was in the yard with Lily when they arrived, both girls building elaborate snow structures that defied physics through determination and childhood optimism. Emma spotted Marcus's truck, dropped her project, ran toward him with the unself-conscious joy that made every risk justified. Marcus caught her, lifted her, felt her small arms wrap around his neck, with the fierce trust that children gave parents who kept promises. Emma pulled back, studied his face with eyes too knowing for 7 years. Marcus thought of the canyon of the wind trying to kill them, of Elena's voice telling him to leave her, of the choice he'd made that was really no choice at all, because Marines didn't leave people behind, even when mathematics suggested leaving was rational. Emma seemed satisfied. She wriggled down, grabbed Marcus's hand, pulled him toward the elaborate snow structure that needed adult appreciation. Kate appeared beside Elena, both women watching the girls with expressions that acknowledged this moment was fragile and precious, and potentially the beginning of something neither was ready to name but both wanted to protect. That evening, Marcus received the call he'd been expecting. Emma's asthma specialist, Dr. Chen, her voice carrying cautious optimism that medical professionals learn to cultivate. Marcus's hands shook, holding the phone. Emma was beside him, playing with Captain Hoppy, not understanding that the conversation happening was about whether her future included running and playing and the normal childhood activities that severe asthma had always restricted. Marcus ended the call, looked at Emma, felt his throat tighten with emotion that was half joy, half the accumulated grief of watching his daughter struggle to breathe for 7 years. Emma looked up at her father, at the man who'd just flown into a blizzard to save strangers, and asked the question that mattered more than any rescue mission. Marcus knelt, bringing himself to eye level with his daughter. Emma's face transformed, hope and joy and disbelief combining into an expression that made every sacrifice, every midnight shift, every moment of 3 years invisible, worthwhile. 3 months telescope passed with the accelerated pace that followed. Crisis survived. Preston's trial was swift, overwhelming evidence, multiple witnesses' confession on recording. The jury deliberated 40 minutes before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Preston was sentenced to 40 years federal prison, no parole, assets seized and redistributed to victims' families. Kate rebuilt Morgan Aviation's leadership, implemented the Morgan Reed Safety Initiative that became industry standard. The Pentagon renewed contracts with stipulations ensuring transparency. Investors who'd supported Preston quietly divested. Marcus discovered that directing security was fundamentally similar to leading Marines: establish standards, enforce accountability, trust, but verify. His team initially treated him with wariness that evolved into respect. When they learned about the home invasion, Preston's arrest, the decorated Marine who'd walked their halls invisible for 3 years. Emma's health improved with better medication, comprehensive care that required insurance. Marcus finally had. Her specialist's cautious optimism transformed into genuine hope. New treatment protocols, better long-term prognosis, possibility of normal childhood activities. The day Emma ran for the first time without wheezing, without stopping to catch her breath, without the omnipresent fear that had shadowed her entire life, that victory mattered more than any medal Marcus had earned in 20 years of service. 6 months after Preston's arrest, Kate invited Marcus and Emma to dinner at her house. The invitation had become routine, 3 or 4 times weekly, two families merging gradually. Emma and Lily were inseparable now, sisters, in everything except biology, building friendships that children forged when adults stopped interfering. Over dinner, Marcus grilling steaks, Kate preparing sides. The girls setting the table. Conversation flowed with ease that came from months of practice. They discussed school projects, work challenges, Emma's upcoming soccer tryouts, the kind of domestic minutiae that meant safety and stability. After the girls went to bed, Marcus and Kate sat on the porch. The pattern established comfortable silence between people who'd survived combat together. Kate leaned against his shoulder, the contact casual but significant. Marcus's arm wrapped around her shoulders. Kate pulled back enough to see his face. Marcus thought carefully, looking at this woman who'd dismantled her father's legacy to honor her husband's memory, who'd chosen truth over empire, who'd flown into a storm with him because some convictions required accepting risk. Kate smiled, squeezed his hand, released it. They sat watching stars, existing in the moment without demanding it become anything more than what it was. Two damaged people discovering that damage didn't preclude connection. The memorial ceremony happened on the anniversary of David's death. Morgan Aviation unveiled a garden dedicated to the 6 engineers who died, each name engraved on stone with specificity that transcended corporate platitude. Kate spoke first, describing David's integrity, his commitment to safety, his belief that aviation should serve humanity rather than exploit it. Winters followed, describing David's military service. Other speakers added layers to portraits Preston had tried to erase. Marcus was asked to speak. He'd prepared remarks typed and edited, but standing at the podium overlooking an assembled crowd, those words felt insufficient. Emma sat in the front row, flanked by Lily and Kate, all three watching him with expressions that demanded honesty. Marcus stopped, throat closed with emotion he couldn't control. Kate stood, walked to the podium, placed her hand on his arm. The gesture was support and permission. Marcus stepped back, let her take over. After the ceremony, veterans approached men who'd served with David or Marcus, who wanted to acknowledge brotherhood that transcended discharge papers. They shared stories that carried weight of shared experience civilians couldn't fully access. That evening, Kate's invitation felt different, more formal. She'd asked Marcus to come without. Emma had arranged for both girls to have a sleepover at Lily's friend's house. Marcus arrived at sunset, found Kate waiting on the porch wearing a dress instead of her usual professional attire. Kate gestured to the truck, keys in hand. They drove in comfortable silence toward the northern ridge, toward the mountains where Rebecca had died and Elena had survived, toward the place where everything had changed. The road deteriorated from paved to gravel to barely maintain track, the same route Marcus had driven in blizzard conditions 6 months ago. Kate stopped where the road ended. They hiked the final quarter mile to the crash site, not the burned wreckage anymore, but a meadow that summer had transformed with wildflowers, nature reclaiming ground that violence had scorched. Kate stood at the clearing's edge, looking at mountains painted gold by sunset. Marcus's chest tightened, understanding what she was asking. They dated carefully over 6 months' slow courtship that respected grief and damage, but both understanding that careful meant cautious, meant avoiding the question that needed asking eventually. Kate turned to face him, pulled a small box from her pocket. Inside, a ring, simple silver band, engraved with words Marcus recognized from David's video. She held it toward him, hands trembling slightly. Marcus stared at the ring, at the woman offering it, at the daughter of the man whose company had killed his wife, now asking him to build a future that honored both their pasts instead of being imprisoned by them. Rebecca's voice echoed in memory, not the dying words, but the healthy words, the conversations about not letting grief transform him into something hollow. She would have liked Kate, would have approved of this woman who'd chosen truth over empire, who'd flown into storms with him, who understood that some promises required accepting risk. Marcus took Kate's hand but didn't take the ring. Kate's face fell until Marcus continued. He pulled out his own ring, his father's wedding band, the one he'd worn until Rebecca died and couldn't bear to wear anymore. Simple gold worn smooth by decades of service and sacrifice. Kate's eyes filled with tears. Marcus slipped his father's ring onto Kate's finger, then took her ring and placed it on his own hand. The silver band caught sunset light, the engraving visible. Some promises outlive us. They stood in the meadow where Marcus had pulled Kate from burning wreckage 6 months ago, where Rebecca had died 3 years ago, where nature had transformed violence into beauty through patience and seasons that healed what trauma couldn't. Emma and Lily appeared at the meadow's edge, not part of the plan, but Lily had apparently convinced her friend's mother to bring them here children, understanding that this moment needed witnesses. Emma ran forward, Captain Hoppy forgotten in her excitement. Marcus knelt, bringing both girls into embrace that included Kate, 4 people who'd been broken by different losses, now choosing to be whole together. The sun set over mountains that had taken so much and given back possibility. Marcus looked at his daughter, breathing easily. No wheeze, alive and healthy, and running at Kate, beside him at Lily, completing their circle at the ring on his finger that promised futures instead of mourning pasts. Elena had asked him once in the hospital after her crash why he'd saved her, knowing who she was, knowing what her father's company had cost him. Marcus hadn't had words then, had only known that leaving people to die wasn't something he could train himself to accept. But standing in the meadow with his daughter and the woman he'd agreed to marry, understanding that love didn't erase grief but made grief bearable. Marcus finally had the answer Elena had needed, because promises mattered more than pain. Because Marines didn't leave people behind. Because Rebecca had died asking him to keep living, and keeping that promise meant accepting that life included risk and joy in ratios that changed daily, but always added up to more than surviving. Kate leaned against him. Emma and Lily between them, all 4 watching stars appear over mountains where helicopter crashes had brought them together, and wildflowers proved that destruction could transform into growth given time and courage. Marcus looked at the ring on his finger, at the woman beside him, at his daughter breathing easily for the first time in her life. The words were simple, true, complete. Some wars ended in victory, some in understanding that fighting mattered more than winning, and some, the rarest kind, ended in meadows where wildflowers grew on scorched earth, where families formed from fragments of families destroyed, where promises outlived the people who'd made them, but were honored by the people who remained. Marcus Reed, decorated Marine radar technician, security director, guardian, had spent 3 years invisible. Had emerged from that invisibility not as the warrior he'd been, but as something more complicated and more necessary. A father who kept promises, a man who flew into storms because some debts could only be paid in courage. A guardian who understood that protection meant accepting risk instead of avoiding it. The helicopter that had crashed in this meadow was gone, replaced by flowers. The company that had killed Rebecca was rebuilt under leadership that valued lives over profit. Preston Blackwell was in prison where corruption belonged. And Marcus Reed was exactly where he needed to be, in a meadow with his family watching stars appear, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges, but tonight brought peace. Emma's voice broke the comfortable silence. Marcus kissed the top of her head. Kate's hand found his. They stood together in twilight that softened edges that made mountains gentle instead of threatening, that proved some endings were really beginnings if you had courage to recognize them. The meadow held them father-daughters, future wife, while stars emerged and wind carried the scent of wildflowers that grew where helicopters had burned, proving that even the worst violence could transform into beauty, given enough time and the right people refusing to let destruction have the final word. Marcus had saved Elena Sterling from this meadow 6 months ago. But standing here with Emma and Kate and Lily, he understood that the real rescue had been mutual, that survivors saved each other not once but continuously, that families were built from fragments of families destroyed, that promises outlived the people who made them but demanded honor from the people who remained. The night deepened, the stars multiplied, and Marcus Reed, no longer invisible, no longer alone, chose to believe that futures could be built on foundations of loss if you had courage to construct them and patience to let wildflowers grow where fire had scorched earth bare. This was the ending. This was the beginning. This was the meadow where everything had changed and nothing would ever be the same, where a Marine had refused to leave someone behind and discovered that staying required more courage than leaving, but offered rewards that transcended survival. The mountains watched. The stars witnessed. And four people who'd learned that loss didn't end stories, but transformed them, stood together in the kind of peace that had to be earned through sacrifice and pain and the daily choice to keep living when surviving would have been easier. Some promises you made, some you kept, and some the most important kind you honored by becoming the person who could keep them, even when keeping them cost everything, and return something you hadn't known you needed until it was offered freely in a meadow where wildflowers grew. Marcus looked at the ring on his finger one final time before Kate's hand covered his warm and real, and choosing him despite knowing everything he'd been and everything he'd done. The words were simple, complete, true enough for the moment and all the moments that would follow.